All right, everybody. Our next speaker is a news developer for the Seattle Times and author of the Carrot text editor for Chrome OS. And he's here to talk about how JavaScript is used at the Seattle Times to tell new kinds of stories. Please warmly welcome to the stage, Thomas Wilburn.
Thank you. All right, so my name is Thomas. I'm here to talk to you about committing acts of daily journalism. I put out a call on Twitter for what my talk should be about, which is totally a thing you should do after it gets accepted. That's the best practice. This was one of the responses I get. But I actually have a lot of titles that I often use when I introduce myself. So my business card says News Web Developer, but that just sounds like people have crammed 3 words together. If you look on the website, it says that I am Interactives, which is basically just an attempt to get people to stop emailing me when we shadow ban them from the comments. It hasn't worked. But usually when I introduce myself, I say that I'm a data journalist, right? Similar to the way that a photojournalist tells stories with pictures, I tell stories with data. And to do that, I work on the web. So I make graphics for stories. I build out our big features. I build tools. I don't work on all this other stuff. I can't help you with it. If you are a subscriber, I can route you to people who can actually help. But before I joined the Seattle Times 3 years ago, if the newsroom wanted to do something interesting online, they actually had to go to either IT or marketing and borrow resources to do that. And of course, those people are busy. And so what that meant is that typically, the kinds of stuff that made it onto the website was pretty much just pulled from print. 800 words, maybe a photo, maybe a graphic, but that graphic was meant to be visible on 11 inches of newsprint. It wasn't designed for online. And so Kathy Best, who was the executive editor at the time, hired me, and then we started building a small team to try and put together people who could tell stories in new ways online, people who could find interesting ways that we could convince people, hopefully, to pay us for the newspaper, which is much harder than you would think it is. So let's look at an example. These are the Profanity Peak Wolf Pack. And in addition to having like the world's best trivia team name, these wolves are a success story because as of about 1900, wolves in Washington state had in large part been wiped out. And then they've started making a comeback. And they live typically coexisting with the cattle that graze on federal allotments. But this pack has a history. And so reporter and national treasure Linda Mapes came to me and she said, I want to do a story on these wolves and their conflicts with the ranchers. Now, I've worked with Linda before, and so I know that anytime she comes to me with a story, she's a phenomenal reporter. It's going to be amazing. And she's worked with me before, so she knows that I need as much data as she can get. So she put in a ton of records requests. She went to her sources. We got the fire maps that chase these wolves out of their previous domain. We got elevation maps, and then you've got locations where they attacked cattle. We have where their den was, where the salt lick. We've got these CSI reports, and these are great because they've got like the little circles for like where the wolf touched you. And sometimes they're just blank because they just ate the whole cow, which is amazing. And so from those, we actually put together a combination of JSON and then this JPEG where the red pixels are being used for height and the blue pixels are being used for wolf activity. And then using WebGL, we brought that in. It's a little dark, but this went live yesterday. In the middle of the story, we tell about the sequence of events that led to the Profanity Peak Pack attacking cattle, and unfortunately, the state taking action and killing 7 members of the pack. So there are now, we think, 4 members remaining, a female and 3 juveniles. But all of this is possible because we're able to stretch out and figure out, well, what could we do that's a more interesting way to tell this story? Now, that said, I love my job, but I mean, I got to admit, like, it has problems. I'm entering into a newsroom environment, so I'm working with journalists, and they're very smart people, but they're not technical. So they don't know what I do. They don't pay me necessarily what I would get elsewhere. And I work on not a sprint timeline, but I work on a journalistic timeline, which means that I have to go through and make projects happen kind of as news happens and not necessarily as I would prefer. I think I really enjoy this because I thrive in unpredictable situations, but I think most developers would probably murder an editor and no jury in the land would convict you. So what I want to talk today about is how we have tried to address these problems. First, I want to talk about how the newsroom has influenced the tooling and the scaffolding that we use. Then I want to talk about our spreadsheet-first development model. And then finally, I want to talk about how journalism's future is really closely tied to the web. But I do want to stress, right, my situation is very different. I work on a very small team, about 2.5 people. Like, we're broke. And my goals are different from what most people are trying to do. Or, in other words, since I have a lot of shape over my job, it just feels really good to tell you all this. Like, I feel like we've bonded now that I've opened myself up, right? Like, I feel like I could tell you anything now. So this is going to be great. I'm looking forward to it. So let's talk about the Seattle Times News app template. All of our stuff, all of the projects that we build, whether it's something that's embedded in another story or whether it's a full-blown enterprise piece, they're all built on this news app template. A news app is a term of art that people really used in the mid-2000s. Brian Boyer at the Chicago Tribune popularized this. Unfortunately, when we brought it to the Times, everybody just thought it meant we worked on the iPhone app, which we do not. And so we actually became the interactives team, but at that point it's too late to rename the repo, so we just left it in place. And what this is it's a grunt-based scaffolding. So it's similar now to these things that have become very common, like create React app. You run a command and it sets up your whole directory. And technically, I don't think it's very interesting. Local development server, live reload, we got some tooling, brings in some snippets. I think the most interesting thing about it, to be honest with you, is that as journalists, our job is to take data and turn it into story as fast as possible. And so for us, a lot of this template is oriented around creating a processing pipeline that makes that possible. So any of these formats and a couple more, CSV, JSON, Markdown, if you put those in the directory, they're immediately sucked in and placed on a variable where they're available as an array or an object to the templating system. And then because so many frameworks now, this is great, are kind of like web component-y, it's really easy then to turn those into smart markup, right? So we can just flow that data directly through the process. Another thing that's really important is archiving. And that's part of why we build on this scaffolding. It's part of what it's designed for. When I first got to the paper, my predecessors had not been technical people. But they were still trying to do the kinds of things that we do now. So they did this through third-party services. And then they would leave the paper, and they would take the credit card with them. And now it's award season, and your page has a big 503 in the middle of it. And nobody understands why you can't fix it. So instead, what we do is everything inside of the project is built as an immutable collection of static files that we rebuild out of the system, and we upload that. Shout out to Kat for her talk yesterday, because the package lock thing is actually going to be a big deal for us, right? Being able to grab a project and install it into exactly the same dependency state is going to be really important should I ever need to revise something. And we try not to do that, the same way that I don't make a reporter go back and rewrite a story when something new happens. They write a new story, we make a new interactive, but we try and keep it self-contained for practicality. Now, not everybody does this. I'm a little snarky about it. This is a well-tested strategy in the news industry. So NPR, the Washington Post, Texas Tribune started at the Chicago Trib. We've based our work on that. But there are newsrooms that actually build more traditional web apps. ProPublica, for example, does amazing work. They have their Dollars for Docs program, which is a huge database of payments that medical companies make to doctors. And it's fully searchable, and it's super cool. But they have staff and money to maintain things, and we don't. So we tend to work on this static collection, and then we upload those things to Amazon S3, which it could be anything else, right? But S3 has been a good match for us. When I first showed up at the Times, they told me, I went to IT and I said, hi, I'm the new developer, I'm working in the newsroom. And they were like, cool, you can put your stuff into WordPress. And I said, cool, I will fill your computers with spiders. And so eventually we negotiated a little bit, and they are insect-free, and I have an AWS token. So we don't want to work in WordPress. We want to work in an isolated environment. I also don't want to be called when anything goes wrong, so S3 is great, because in the event that it does crash, Netflix will also be down, and so no one will care about the Seattle Times, which is great. It's true. I'm not saying that's a sustainable strategy, but it is a strategy. And our traffic is very peaky. Like, some things we'll do will just kind of fly under the radar, and some things are a huge hit, and you never know. And the nice thing about S3 is I don't really worry about having a scaling strategy, because I know that it can handle pretty much anything I throw at it. Now, of course, there are things that you can't do when you're working entirely with static files. User-generated content is tough. Comments, I don't really care, but some people do. I can't customize a page for sharing. Really, the only thing that I honestly feel has had a true impact is that we can't run a server to query. And so, for example, I can't build dollars for docs. Or I could, but it would be very difficult. I'd have to kind of pre-bake a lot of database views into files and figure out how to load that without killing the browser. So we don't do it. But the thing that I've generally found is that people don't want to do that. Like, people don't want to run arbitrary queries. I think people want to be told stories about the news. And that means that you can focus that data. So, for example, our reporter, Evan Bush, did a story on animal trophies after Cyrus the lion was killed. And so we imported 7.1 million lines of database information from the ports on animal imports. But we didn't present that to the user. Instead, we focused that down into what was a year in the life of endangered animal trophies for the Seattle port. And then we could walk people through that very directly. So I think focus means that, yeah, we can't do these things, but I don't honestly miss it very much. But the next stage is that all of this so far has been open source. And if you want to check it out, the links are in the slides, right? You're welcome to see any of our work. We try and put as much of it on GitHub as possible. There is one kind of closed source thing that we use and that I am obsessed with, and that's Google Sheets. And I am an old Excel nerd, so I just fell headfirst into this. But a lot of people have these horror stories about spreadsheets where we've all worked for a business, and they're like, yeah, man, they didn't have a customer database. There was just this sheet, and they ran everything out of this spreadsheet. And everyone treats this like it's the boogeyman. But I think this is a tribute to just how powerful spreadsheets are. If you think about it, they combine code and data and state. They're like a small talk VM that actual people use. I was kind of curious if people like Alan Kay storms the stage, but I'm okay so far. So we've made Sheets a first-class citizen in the template. Alongside of CSV, it's actually the same process. They pull in. We do cache it because sometimes it goes down, and then everybody on my Twitter list freaks out. But we can pull this in. The hardest thing has actually just been training users how to set it up, because they're not used to the idea of kind of how one row per item works. You want this to work like a database. But if you set it up for them, it works great, and reporters actually love it, which surprised me. But it's a great way of organizing their thoughts. It's probably not the way I would use it, but it works really well. But then sometimes maybe you've looked at a spreadsheet and you've said, that's cool, but what if this was Turing complete? And if that is not your nightmare scenario, Google Apps Script exists, which is Google's version of the Visual Basic that ships with Excel. And it is a JavaScript-based language. It runs in a Rhino VM, so it's not fast, and it doesn't have access to the Node ecosystem, but it does have access to all this stuff. I can talk to Sheets and Docs. I can store and write blobs to Drive. I can get to Maps. I can send mail. I can read a Gmail account. It's really, really impressive stuff. So let's take a look at what that looks like and see how horribly this will break. So I have a sheet here, and this is a sheet. It may be a little tough to read, but these are cheap eats. We've got this feature that's been running for years, and we wanted to map cheap eats. So I've got a whole sheet here, and in one of the columns, it says address. But I want to load these into leaflet, and so I need lat-long coordinates. So in my editor for the script, I have this function that basically just grabs this, looks for the address column, looks for the lat column, and then it talks to the Maps geocoder service. And so it can actually feed those addresses into Google Maps as if you had typed them, and then get back the results. And if we look at this, you'll see it's now filling in lat longs as it finds those out. So you can run these manually, like I do. You can run them on a timer, which is interesting. You can actually build them as whole add-ons. I've never actually gone that crazy. That's a little fancy for me. The next thing we want to show off, let's give this a shot. All right, so let's say that that's not horrifying enough, that you're running like JavaScript in your spreadsheet. You can actually publish a Google Apps script as a web service. And then you can talk to that web service over JSON-P, because it doesn't set the CORS headers, but you can make a JSON-P request. And so if you were to visit this URL, or there's a link to the actual thing in the slideshow comments, you would actually see this page where we can ask, how's the talk going so far? And I thought I was presenting before lunch, so that should actually be, when's the break? And if you were to vote on this, this is actually, it can go out, and it will talk to this endpoint here. So I've got a whole little, it's like the world's saddest routing system here, right? But this sheet talks to it, and then you vote. And in real time, we are, let me zoom out. As people vote, it's going in, looking at the sheet, and incrementing those numbers. So again, it's not fast, but we have actually used this. We've got a couple of projects where we wanted to do commenting in a more customized way than our normal solution was. I've used this for the Seahawks fan map, and actually we ran out of geocoder tokens. I'm not saying this is a best practice. I am saying MacGyver's a hell of a drug. It's basically what I'm getting at here. So the cool thing about having this whole workflow where I've got the client-side code can talk to Sheets, and then Sheets runs into my build system, is that I can actually use this as kind of a very ad hoc server. And I have used this for elections, where we will have control information in the sheet, and then we've got a cron task in our grunt list of tasks, and it just reruns the build every 2 minutes. And so every 2 minutes, it goes out and it gets the sheet, it goes out and it gets election results, it merges those, and it republishes. And so although it looks like we have a live server, we don't. And it's very fault tolerant, because if any part of this falls over, it'll just build with old data, but it never actually crashes the database. There's no database to crash. As I said, this is not best practice, but if you think this is interesting for a small or a hobby site, Jessica Lord has a great talk on the library that she built, SheetC, for working with Sheets, and I highly recommend that. So when I first started, the Seattle Times is actually not my first journalism job. I actually started as an audio producer, and then I got a job at Congressional Quarterly in 2007. And it was this incredibly rich time to be building things on the web, right? The iPhone comes out, so you've got all this mobile stuff just popping up everywhere. Flash is being superseded by HTML5, so people are creating new, interesting ways to do things graphically. It was just a great time to kind of I hadn't done coding since college, and getting back into it and realizing there's so much cool stuff that we can do here. But journalists have actually been really potent members of the web community for a long time, right? The top row, backbone_CoffeeScript D3, those are all New York Times projects by Mike Bostock and Jeremy Ashkenas. Svelte and Rollup by Rich Harris, now actually at the New York Times. You can tell who's hiring here. Adrian Holovati wrote Django while he was at the Trib. PIM is a project for responsive iframes from NPR. And of course, the original kind of test case for responsive design was at the Boston Globe. That was the one that when you wanted to show people, oh, if I drag the browser, it resizes, that was where you went. So journalists have been on the bleeding edge of this in part because we push these systems. We have this opportunity with these small projects to build things that do really weird stuff that we then don't have to maintain. So you can create really interesting ways of using the web. And if you think about it, that's really important to us. The way that the web works is so important. Think about what it would take if I wanted to ship the kinds of things that I build, but I wanted to do it through native code, right? I would have to find some way to distribute to you. I need a scripting engine, and it ought to be pretty fast because I'm going to deal with data. I need some sort of rendering support. I want to be able to pull in media because I work with our video team and I work with audio, all kinds of pictures and data. I need to be able to pull in social media embeds for various reporting tasks, and because sometimes we report live based on that stuff. So I've got all this stuff I need to mix together, plus I need to be able to do this safely in a sandbox without, without possibly breaking out, and I need to be able to do it within the review process. So I don't want to be in a situation where I deploy code and then it gets hung up on some App Store reviewer for like 2.5 weeks, because at that point, that's an old story and nobody cares. The lesson that I take from this is that you really can't do modern journalism anywhere but the web, I think. And I'm biased because that's my job. But that's my personal opinion, is that we're really tied together, right? Journalism and the web. It's important to us. And it's not that people haven't tried, right? Like, a couple years after I joined CQ, the iPad came out. And everyone was like, oh, this is going to be great. We're all going to write iPad apps, and people are going to enjoy lean-back experiences, and we're going to be able to afford real dairy creamer again. It's going to be amazing. And it turned out that none of that was true, right? Like, the App Store is a race to the bottom, so people won't pay you. And it turns out that tablets got squeezed between smaller laptops and bigger phones, so they haven't been that successful. And more importantly, nobody wants to pay $6 a month to hear what David Brooks has to say, right? Like, that's not a thing that you're going to buy an app to do. So I would say that as journalists, we have an ethical responsibility to the web. It's actually, for me, it's a part of what I believe is important to me as someone who makes the news. And I think that's for several reasons. I think it's important for a democracy that news be able to reach people with open access, and it should not have a government or another corporation that isn't my publisher telling me what I can and can't write about. I think it's important that we be able to reach readers wherever they are. One of the standbys for me of journalism is the old saying that our role is to comfort the afflicted and afflict the comfortable. And I believe that you can't afflict the comfortable or comfort the afflicted if you are only talking to people who can afford the latest device or can upgrade to the latest operating system and get to that app store. You have to be able to reach everyone. And maybe the most important thing is, at this point in time, our industry is gated not only behind like these app stores and the economic problems that we have, but you've got Facebook and Google and Twitter and these social media services, all of whom are trying to create a scenario in which they own a chunk of the web. And I think it's impossible to underestimate how important URLs are, not only because it makes us, the ability to go viral is intrinsic in that, right? Like something as simple as sharing a URL. But maybe more important, that's the way that we get around our only distribution mechanism being a custom share button that we can't influence. We are still, don't get me wrong, way too influenced by that stuff. But we still have the option to go around it. And I think that's really deeply important to us, not only as journalists, but I think as a community. So I want to thank you for listening to me today. Talking about like the tooling that we use, and our weird spreadsheet fetish, and our feelings on the web. If you're interested in learning more about this, we do have a GitHub account, and all of as many as the investigative team will let me open source, as many of our projects are open source as possible, in addition to our news app template and some of the other templates. We have a Twitter account that we don't use very much. We have a dev blog where we sometimes write about what we've done. And then if you're interested in finding me, please feel free to reach out, get in touch, and ask me any questions. Thank you very much.